Hi, my name is Jim Butler, and I'm the CEO and founder of HJ3 Composite Technologies based here in Tucson, Arizona. We're a technology transfer from the University of Arizona, and we supply high-strength composite materials to the construction industry for the repair of infrastructure worldwide. Our company was started back in 2002, and our first initiative was to draft a business plan. A key component of that business plan was identifying our competitive advantage, so that we could properly position our company in the industry we were about to enter. The objectives of today's workshop are first to define what a competitive advantage is. Second is to understand and recognize how to create a competitive advantage and how to make that competitive advantage sustainable. And then finally, to look at your industry and understand the pressures that are at work as you decide how to position your company for the future. A competitive advantage exists when a firm has a superior product or service than that of its competitors, and they're able to translate that competitive advantage into higher profits that exist than the average in the industry. Now, I often find in entrepreneurship that there's two myths that exist. One is that all the good ideas are taken and most good business opportunities are already gone. The second is that small firms, entrepreneurial startups, cannot successfully compete against larger companies. And when we talk about competitive advantage today, it's important to note that how you position your company going forward can successfully overcome these two myths. In addition to the two myths that plague entrepreneurs' thinking, there are three flaws that are common to the entrepreneur when determining what their competitive advantage will be. First, they imitate rivals, thinking that they can gain a small percentage of a large market that already exists by simply copying the product or service that their competitors offer. Second is to create a competitive advantage that's not sustainable and therefore susceptible to imitation. And then finally, third, not properly identifying the attractiveness of an industry and beginning into that industry and realizing that they can't compete with their competitive advantage. So as I mentioned, the first step is to analyze your industry. The tool we're going to use is called the Porter's 5 Forces model. And the goal here is to understand the forces that create the competitive pressure in your industry and then to properly position your company. And you can see that those 5 forces are shown here on this model. First, we want to look at industry competitors and understand the intensity of the rivalry. Second, we want to look at the threat of new entrants and understand the barriers to entry that currently exist. Third, we want to look at substitutes and how they affect your pricing and the ability for consumers to switch from your product to alternatives. And then finally, we want to discuss the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers in your market to see what their influences are on pricing and the cost to compete. So the first step in the Porter's 5 Forces model is to determine the intensity of rivalry in the industry. This will impact prices that companies are able to charge for their products and services, as well as costs that must be incurred to compete in product development, sales, and advertising. If you're in an industry characterized by high intensity of rivalry among its competitors, you may find that there are many players similar in size. Those players might have similar strategies and products or services. There might be very little differentiation between the players. And finally, this will all affect profitability as those companies are unable to make high profit margins. An important part of analyzing the intensity of competition in your industry is to analyze your competitors. First, it's important to create a comparison grid. On the left-hand side, you can see here different factors that you will compare competitors by. These should be very pertinent to your industry and should comprise about 10 or 15 unique characteristics. You can see here I've listed sales, price, packaging, quality, and client fulfillment. And I've ranked your company against 3 of your largest competitors. And you can see in this model, you may be the high quality player that practices high client fulfillment. Your customers are extremely happy and you have the best product. And you're able to charge a higher price for those services. But even though you're best in class, the question becomes, how do I translate that to sales and growing my company against competitors that have inferior products and client fulfillment? After evaluating the intensity of rivalry among competitors, it's important to look at the bargaining power of suppliers to your industry. The higher the bargaining power, the more impact they will have on the cost of your raw materials and your inputs. And so a good way to look at this is to sit across the table from your suppliers and imagine in a negotiation how much leverage they have over you. If the market is dominated by few large suppliers and there's very little substitutes, they're going to have a lot of leverage. And if there's high switching costs to switch from one supplier to another, that also will give them leverage in that negotiation. Therefore, they will have more leverage in that negotiation when you determine what your raw material and input costs from them will be. Likewise, it's important to analyze the bargaining power that your buyers have over you as a company in determining your prices that you're able to charge in the market and the investment required to service them. In markets where buyers have high bargaining power, you'll find that products have plenty of substitutes, that there's very low switching costs to switch to an alternative product. Also, there might be a concentration of buyers or a few buyers for your product, therefore giving them more leverage on the prices you're able to charge. An example of a company that has high bargaining power is Walmart, who often dictates the prices that their suppliers will charge to them as the largest retailer of consumable goods to the market. Now that we've looked at the intensity of rivalry among competitors and the bargaining power of both suppliers and buyers, it's important to look at the threat of new entrants. This will directly impact how much you're able to charge for your product or services, as competitors coming into the market can undercut your price. Also, this will shape your investment strategy as you try to deter those entrants from entering the market through patent applications, certification and testing, and other types of barriers to entry. Now, different examples of barriers to entries that deter entrants include economies of scale, brand loyalty, intellectual property in the form of patents, trade secrets, and know-how, high upfront capital requirements, as well as creating high switching costs for customers in the terms of legal contracts possibly, or in customer loyalty programs. And then finally, legislation and government standards may impact an industry in the form of certifications that are required or licenses that are required to operate within that market. It's also important to look at the threat of substitutes that might exist as alternative to your products that offer possibly better pricing or better performance for the same market. To restrict substitutes, it's important that companies build brand loyalty as well as close relationships with the people that purchase their product or service. Additionally, it's important to generate high switching costs for customers who are looking to use a substitute to your product. Finally, the relative price performance of substitutes might offer a cost savings, but not necessarily the same benefits that you're offering through your product or service. Now, let's take an example, such as Apple Computer, and use the Porter's 5 Forces analysis to determine how Apple should position itself within its industry. And you can see here that we're looking at the PC market, the online music and applications market, as well as mobile devices. And you can see that we have our 5 categories, the 5 forces from the Porter analysis listed here on the left. And we're simply using a ranking mechanism of low, medium, and high. And you can see as far as threat of entry is concerned, that all of these markets have high capital requirements, high brand loyalty in the products that are purchased from the consumer, as well as intense intellectual property that can create barriers to entry. So we would say that the threat of entry is low. Additionally, on the intensity of rivalry, you can see that few players make up this market. On the PC market and the online music market, there's very different strategies and high differentiation and how those products are designed and brought to market. In the mobile devices market, however, there's more competition and much more imitation. The second the iPhone was created, 4 or 5 other manufacturers came out with products that were very similar. Now let's look at the threat of substitutes that exist in these markets. You can see that the threat of substitutes for the PC market and online music market, as well as the applications on the iPhone, are very low. And the reason for that is high brand loyalty, as well as high switching costs. In the mobile devices, we see that the threat of substitutes are a little higher, and the reason for that is there's more competition, there's more imitation among phones that are being manufactured, and additionally, there's more influence by the people providing long-distance plans in determining which phone that you will buy. When we look at the power of suppliers in this market, we see that in the PC market and the mobile devices market, the power of suppliers are low. That's primarily due to supply contracts that these computer manufacturers have with their suppliers to maintain pricing over a long period of time. Additionally, many of these companies are very self-reliant when it comes to the development of new technologies. When we look at the power of suppliers in the online music category, however, you can see that the content providers have more influence and more negotiating power. And the reason for that is because they are offering exclusive content in the form of music, books, and other things that are protected by copyright and licenses. Now let's look at the power of buyers in these markets. You can see that the power of the buyer in the PC market and mobile device market is fairly moderate to high. And the reason for that is because consumers have more alternatives when they're looking to buy a computer or a mobile device. However, their bargaining power in the online music category is low. And the reason is for the high switching costs, because you cannot download that music and purchase that music unless you already own the consumer electronic device such as an iPhone or iPod that allows you to download that music. So very high switching costs. Now that we've looked at Apple Computer in the Porter's Five Forces model, I think it's important next to see how Apple stacks up against its competition. And you can see here we're going to evaluate the competition and Apple on these categories: price, quality, hip features, quality of packaging, and client fulfillment. So now let's start with pricing. You can see that the lowest priced competitor in this market for PCs is Lenovo, followed by Dell, Hewlett-Packard, and then finally Apple. So how is Apple able to charge a higher price for its products? Well, let's look at the next categories. You can see that the quality of the Apple products is ranked as a number one. So they have the highest quality of products. You can also see that as far as features are concerned and being hip in design, Apple is ranked number one. In terms of quality of packaging, Apple is ranked number one. And in terms of client fulfillment, we also rank Apple number one because of the service and training that goes into teaching people how to use Apple products. In comparison to HP, Dell, and Lenovo, who are selling their products through retail branches unaffiliated with their companies, and often offering 1-800 numbers to offer the same sort of training and services that Apple does in its stores. So because Apple is far superior in quality, features, packaging, and client fulfillment, it's able to charge a higher price for its products to the market, and therefore gain higher profitability than the average profits that exist in the industry. By definition, that is a competitive advantage. So now let's look at Apple in terms of the model of competitive advantage that we discussed earlier. And that competitive advantage stems from Apple's ability to leverage its resources and its capabilities into distinctive competencies. And those resources included brand equity, an installed customer base that's loyal to their product, and the ability of their design teams, along with their capabilities to leverage those resources through continual innovation and rapid product launches to create the best-in-class products that exist in the PC market, supported by the most loyal client base. So in the end, was that a cost advantage or a differentiation advantage? And I think it's obvious, differentiation advantage. According to Lev Grossman, a journalist for Time magazine, he states, Apple is operating its own closed miniature techno-economy. They produce everything themselves, their own hardware, software, operating systems, search engines, and consumer electronics to an adoring client base who can't get enough. That is the definition of a differentiation advantage. And it's creating tremendous value for Apple's client base. But more importantly, they're able to leverage that differentiation advantage, that competitive advantage, into higher profits than those averaged by its competitors in the same industry. So now, having used Apple as an example for how to evaluate the industry that they function in and how they position themselves, you can use those same 5 steps to evaluate your company, your competition, and the industry that you will compete in. And those 5 steps, again, are first to analyze the industry using the Porter analysis. That will help you determine the competitive pressures that exist in your industry. Second, analyze and compare your firm to your competitors. That'll help you understand where you're weak and strong within your industry. Third is to determine what your resources are and your unique capabilities that allow you to leverage those resources into distinct competencies. Fourth, understanding what your competitive advantage is and whether it's a cost or differentiation advantage. And then finally, how to position your firm in the market that you're wishing to compete in so that your competitive advantage helps you to earn profits higher than your competitors and over a long period of time. So what did we learn today? We learned that competitive advantage exists when a firm has a product or service that's perceived by its target market customers to be better than that of its competition. We also learned that that competitive advantage must be leveraged into higher profits that far exceed the average profits within that industry. In our example of Apple computers, they figured out a way to leverage their resources and their unique capabilities to reinvent their products in a market that was highly competitive, that had very low profits, and actually charge a higher price and switch clients from their competitors to their products. We also learned Michael Porter's 5 forces model to help you evaluate your industry, understand the competitive pressures that exist, and more importantly, how to position your company in light of those pressures so that you may have a sustainable competitive advantage over a long period of time. So now you have the tools, you have the examples that can help you to begin evaluating your industry and how to position your company. But I wanted to stress that this is not a one-time process. At HJ3, we've learned over the years that our initial strategy didn't work. And we felt the bumps and bruises along the way as we picked the wrong strategy. And we constantly repositioned ourselves by evaluating our market and understanding how we could differentiate ourselves, find niche markets that we could succeed in. And over time, those competitive forces helped to polish our business model and now allow us to be successful in the markets that we've selected. So now that we've defined competitive advantage and we've shown you some of the tools to evaluate your industry, it's up to you to determine what your competitive advantage is that allows you to distinguish yourself from your competition so that you may have a long, successful career as an entrepreneur. I want to thank you for joining us today in this workshop, and I want to remind you of one thing. This process of determining how to position your company in the competitive environment that exists within your industry is an ongoing process, and these tools can constantly serve you to help you reposition your company over time so that you may achieve success as an entrepreneur. Thank you.